question, the mixed practice. Quadratic formula is given. Excuse me. I know I sang that to you to the tune of Pop Goes the Weasel as a way to help you memorize it and learn it, but we decided we will give you the quadratic formula on the test so you don't have to have it memorized. So it was given here. Okay, these are the 5 methods that we've talked about solving quadratics with. We've talked about graphing, factoring, square root method, completing the square, and quadratic formula. Okay, not every problem can be solved with all 5. The only 2 that work every single time, no matter what, are completing the square and quadratic formula. Okay, however, I feel like graphing is the easiest. So if I were a student taking this test tomorrow, my first option, what I would do every time is to first put it in Desmos and look at the graph and see if I can solve it that way. Okay, then if I can't, then I would move on to a different method. If I can't solve it graphing, I'm not going to be able to solve it by factoring, and I'm not going to be able to solve it. I might be able to for square roots. It just depends. If I can't solve it graphing, that either means that it doesn't cross the x-axis. You would see that on the graph, and that means that the answers are imaginary. Okay, and I would have to do completing the square quadratic formula. Or if it does cross the x-axis, I just can't determine what that number is because it's a decimal. It gives it to me as a rounded decimal in Desmos. Then that means it's just an irrational solution. And again, I would recommend, if that's the case, you can't solve it by graphing, I would probably just go to quadratic formula. That would be your best bet. Now, there are some that factoring is pretty straightforward, pretty simple. Square root method is pretty straightforward and pretty simple. So I'll talk about those as we go through these 4. So on number 1, just a quick show of hands. When you raise your hands, raise them up high so I can see them. How many of y'all used graphing? Okay, how many tried factoring? All right, you can't do square root method on this because see how there's 2 x terms? Square root method would not work. Okay, did anybody try completing the square? How many used quadratic formula? Okay, so it was a mix of graphing, factoring, or quadratic formula. I didn't see anybody raise their hand for completing the square, and you can't do square root. Okay, so you had 3 options here that y'all used. Again, my gut reaction for solving quadratics is to put it in the calculator first and look at the graph. Okay, so I'm going to show that to you first. All right, so this is 4x squared minus 12x 8. Now remember, to enter the equations in the calculator to see the parabola like this, it does need to be set equal to 0, okay, which all of these are, so that's good. But if it wasn't, if this had been an equal sign, equal to -8, we would have had to move the 8 over to make it the +8 on the left. Okay, so sometimes you'll have to move terms across the equation to get it set equal to 0 before you can type it in your calculator. Okay, but once you have it in the calculator, if you're looking for roots or zeros, that's your x-intercepts, remember? And so I can see here it's 1 and 2. Okay, so this one could be solved by graphing, and I think that's the quickest and easiest way to do it. So your answers should have been 1 and 2. Okay, so just mark if you got that right or wrong. Okay, if you did it with quadratic formula or you did it by factoring, that's fine. You still should have gotten the same answers. If you tried those other methods and got it wrong, just note that. Just note, like with an X or a check here next to number 1, whether you got it right or wrong for me. Okay, just so we have that data. Remember, it's not hurting you. This isn't for a grade. I just want to know what method you're using and whether you got it right or wrong using that method. All right, then number 2. Show of hands, how many used graphing? Factoring. This could have been done factoring. This is a special type of factoring. I know nobody raised their hand in here, but this is a difference of two squares. You could have done this one by factoring. Okay, square root method. Yeah, for me, when I look at this and I see that there's only one x term, see how there's an x squared, but there's not just an x? I initially think square root method. There's only one x term in my quadratic. I only have the x squared, no x. I'm just going to do square root method. That's my initial thought on this type of problem. Okay. Did anybody try completing the square? Quadratic formula? Okay. So I'm going to check first in the calculator and see what the graph looks like. So this is 9x squared minus 25. Okay, so here's my graph. So it does cross the x-axis twice, but look at those solutions. Those are decimals. We're not accepting decimal answers. Okay, so I can't really use the calculator solely for this one. Now, if your decimal was something like 0.5, you know how to change that to a fraction, don't you? What is 0.5 as a fraction? 1/2. Okay, but do you know what 1.667 as a fraction is? Most of you probably don't know how to change that to a fraction, and that's okay. So you're not going to be able to solve it this way. Now, if you have a basic decimal, like I just said, something like 0.5, your calculator will change it to a fraction for you. It'll tell you that's 1/2. So our answer would be 1/2 if that was the case. But with a decimal like we have, 1.667, notice when I try to change it, it's not going to convert because this is not the exact value. This is a rounded decimal. It's actually 1.6 repeating. Do you all understand that? So it's like 1.6 forever. Notice how many I had to type in to get it to show me what that is as a fraction. If I just typed in the 1.67, it didn't do it. And I just kept going and it's still, I know that's not accurate. And now it's not even showing me anything. And then eventually I get all the way to the end and it does show me, oh, it's 0.6 repeating. That's 5/3. Okay, so technically, if you understand that, you can convert if it's a repeating decimal, it will convert it for you. So the answer here should be positive 5/3 and negative 5/3. Now, the majority of y'all probably didn't realize you could do that in your calculator. Okay, so I'm going to show you how you would have done this by hand. Instead, I would have chosen to use square root method here. Why is my pen not working? Here we go. Well, all right, so I'm going to use square root method. And for some reason, when I try to write in a table, because this is set up as a table, it always moves my writing. So just bear with me. But I would move the 25 over to the other side. And this would become 9x squared equals 25. Okay, I need to move the 9. Okay, it's being multiplied, so I would divide by 9. And I would get x squared equals 25/9. That does not reduce. But now I've isolated what is squared, and I'm ready to take the square root. So I take the square root of both sides, not forgetting my plus or minus. And that comes out to positive or negative. If both terms in your fraction, the numerator and the denominator, are both perfect squares, that's great. It all can come out. When you take the square root of a fraction, you're taking the square root of the numerator and the square root of the denominator. So the square root of 25 is 5 and the square root of 9 is 3. So this is 5/3. And that's what we got when we converted that decimal too, right? So positive or negative 5/3. I'm going to show factoring in a different color. Just for the sake of this, I'm recording this for y'all to study tonight. So factoring, because this is a perfect difference of two squares, it would factor, remember, difference of two squares factors to two nearly identical binomials. Okay, you take the square root of the first term, so that would be 3x. And the square root of the second term, that would be 5. And you do one positive and one negative. And that's how it would factor. And then when you have it factored set equal to 0, you split and solve. And I would solve each of these separately. Nope, that one, yeah. So for this one, I would have to subtract the 5 over and then divide by 3. So I get negative 5/3. And this one, I would have to add the 5 to the other side and then divide by 3. So I get positive 5/3. So either way, whether I did this graphing, factoring, square root method, they all got the same answers. I don't have room to show you another method, but yes, you could have done quadratic formula. Since there is no b term, there's no x, what is your b value? Because remember, standard form is ax squared plus bx plus c. So I have a is the 9 and c is the negative 25, but there's no middle term, no x term. So what is b? If it's not there, what is it? 0. Thank you. So if you wanted to do quadratic formula, you could have your b would be 0. A would be 9, b would be 0, and c would be negative 25. And you could do this with quadratic formula as well. Okay, so just mark whether you got that right or wrong and which method you used. All right, for number 3, again, I right away see that this is not a trinomial. What's missing to make it a trinomial? I have ax squared plus bx. Is there a c? No. So if you wanted to do quadratic formula, c would be what? 0. C would be 0. Okay, so you could do quadratic formula. Okay, you could try completing the square. This one you cannot do square root method because you've got an x squared and an x, so that method is not an option. Of course, you can always try the graphing. I told you that would be my initial move on all of these. So let me go ahead and show you what that graph would look like. Okay, so 15x squared minus 12x, 0, and 0.8. Now again, if you don't realize how to change a decimal, this is a terminating decimal. This is a rational number. Okay, it's not some rounded decimal that we don't know how to change. You should be able to change 0.8 to a fraction, but if you don't know in your head what to do, your calculator will do it for you. 4/5. Now, let me just explain. You should have been able to do that in your head. What place value is this 8 in? Is this the tenths, hundredths, thousandths? What place value is that? That's the tenths. So this is 8/10. 8 over 10. What is 8 over 10 reduced to? 4 over 5. Okay, so this is 0 and 4/5 should be your answers. If you got those, you got it correct. Okay, if you left it as a decimal, if you tried graphing and you just wrote it as a decimal, that's wrong. It's going to be wrong on the test. Okay. It's not going to, your answer choices won't be as decimals. And your free responses won't be written in as decimals. Okay, now if you didn't understand that you could change that decimal to a fraction and you're like, ooh, I don't know. By hand, if I were not graphing this, if I didn't have a graphing calculator, I would look at this and I would realize factoring would be pretty easy here because I can right away see a GCF. Do y'all see that? What would be the GCF here? Yeah, both of those can be divided by 3 and they both have an x. So I could factor out a 3x and that would leave me with what? If I divided both of these terms by 3x, that would become 5x, and that would become just -4. Everybody good with the factoring I did? Once you factor, you're ready to split and solve. And again, I don't know why this is shifting everything I write down. I'm sorry. So we set 3x equal to 0, and you would have to just divide the 3 over, which still leaves you with 0, because 0 divided by anything is 0. Now over here, we would have 5x minus 4 equals 0. We would have to add the 4 to both sides and then divide by 5. So you get 4/5. So whether you did it by graphing or whether you did it by factoring, or if you did this by quadratic formula, you would have gotten the same answer. 0 and 4/5 are your two solutions. So far, so good? Just put a mark, whether a check or an X here, if you got it right or wrong. All right, last but not least. Okay, I'm going to initially check this in the calculator. And see what it looks like. So I've got -2x squared 4x minus 5. Well, look at that. What's happening here? What does this tell you? They're imaginary because I do not see this parabola crossing the x-axis. There is no real solution. So if this had been a multiple choice question, you could eliminate any real numbers from your answer choices. It has to be imaginary. Does everybody understand that? Now, so I can't answer it by graphing, but I could eliminate some answer choices had it been multiple choice. Okay, so I know it's imaginary. That means it's not going to be factorable. I can't use square root method. My only two options are completing the square and quadratic formula. Quick show of hands. How many of y'all did completing the square? How many did quadratic formula? Okay, I'll show you with quadratic formula because it doesn't seem like many people are doing completing the square, and that's fine. You don't have to. Okay, so quadratic formula, we need to identify A, B, and C. Okay, what is A here? Remember, it's ax squared plus bx plus c. So -2. The A is negative. Oh my goodness. Okay, and then B is what? B is +4. Okay, and C? C is -5. Okay, so we've identified our ABC. Now we're going to plug it into the formula. The formula is at the top of the page up here. Okay, now remember, this negative is in the formula. So if your B is negative, make sure that that double negative then makes it a positive. So for that reason, remember those negative signs will throw some of y'all's answers off if you mess up. So I'm going to make sure everywhere I plug in A, B, and C, I'm going to put them in parentheses just so I don't make any mistakes with my signs. Okay, so I'm going to say x is equal to -b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac That's really hard to read. Golly, what is going on? Okay, all over 2a. All right, so I know that one, I'm going to try and see if I can make that a little easier to read right there. Really? Okay. Try this. Just make sure you know that that's a negative. Okay, that's about as best as it's going to get, I guess. All right, to simplify, we're going to take that negative b out in front. It's going to stay negative because b was not negative to begin with, so now it is. So we've got -4 plus or minus the square root. Now, I don't believe we put this vocabulary term in our notes, but when you were doing the delta math, you came across it. The number that you get under the radical here, under the square root, does anybody remember from the delta math that term that it's called? It's called the discriminant. Okay, you had in your delta math assignment, some of this were asking about just finding the discriminant. It was just practicing reducing this number. Okay, that's the b squared minus 4ac. That's your discriminant. So we need to simplify that. And we can't, even though we couldn't see the graph in the calculator, we can use the calculator to get our discriminant. Okay. Well, do this. So negative b plus or minus the square root, and then it's b squared minus 4ac. Oh wait, yeah, -5. So b squared minus 4ac. So I get -24 as my discriminant. So that's what's going to go under the radical, -24. So this is going to be so far so good. Now I need to see if I can simplify. A lot of y'all I think can get to this point, but it's the reducing or simplifying that messes you up. So when I am simplifying my radical, okay, this is what we started the year, January 2024 off with, was simplifying radicals. Okay, I need to see if I can reduce this root -24. Okay, so I'm going to do a factor tree for 24. What are some factors of 24? Any two factors of 24? 6 and 4, okay. Factors of 6. And factors of 4. All right, so here's my factor tree. I'm looking for pairs. So I see a pair of 2s. Now remember, when I say a pair, they don't have to be together coming off of the same branch. This could be my pair of 2s. Okay, it doesn't matter. As long as there's 2 of them, that's a pair. So a 2 gets to come out, and then that 3 and that other 2 do not have pairs, do not have partners, so they have to stay underneath. So what is 3 times 2? 6. So a 2 gets to come out and a 6 stays underneath. Does that make sense? So that's going to be rewritten as 2 root 6 instead of root 24. Now, what about the negative? What's that negative under the radical? How does that come out? I. That's how it's imaginary. It comes out as an I. So it's going to be 2I root 6. So this would be -4 plus or minus 2 I root 6 over negative 4. Now, both the 2 and the 4 in the top can reduce with the 4 in the bottom, but I can't do I'm not going to do the 4 over 4 completely reduced to a 1 because I can't completely reduce the 2 divided by 4. So I'm just going to reduce it all by 2, if that makes sense. So this would become the negative divided by the negative. That's going to become positive, and I don't need to worry about the sign change because of that plus or minus for the second term. Okay, so that's going to become 2 plus or minus I root 6 over 2. So 2 plus or minus I root 6 over 2. If you wanted to reduce that 2 over 2 completely, you would end up with a fraction here in front of I. This is the format you're most likely going to see your answer choices written in. Okay, so I would leave it right like this. I feel okay about that? All right, so I'm going to ask you to scan this QR code and input whether you got each question right or wrong and which method you tried. Okay, so it's just a survey. It's not a grade. Just be honest if you got it right or wrong and which method you tried. So there's like 10 answer choices because it's yes, I got it right using graphing, or no, I got it wrong using graphing. Yes, I got it right doing square root, or no, I got it wrong doing square root. Okay, so there's 10 options and you just pick the one that says if you got it right or wrong and which method you tried. So we can look at that. So I have that data, please. Y'all hang on to those. You can use those as a study tool tonight. I did record this, so you can go back and watch the video if you need to later when you're studying. And don't forget to check your Canvas when where we have the review. Has everybody scanned this? Everybody got it? Okay, so I'm going to pull up our Canvas. Here we go. On our Canvas, let me go to student view here. If you go to assignments and go to our review, that is where you will find the key to check your review and the videos if you have questions on the review still. I do have tutorials today. I will be here for tutorials if you need to come by. Student view here, come on. So this is what it looks like. Review Unit 6. That's where you're going to click, and you can go find the key and the videos for the review.